The courtroom was silent, the kind of stillness that hangs heavy in the air right before something explosive happens. The flickering fluorescent lights above only added to the sterile, impersonal feel of the place. George Miller, a man well into his 70s, sat in the defendant's chair, trying to steady his trembling hands. His fingers, once strong from years of labor, now shook from the weight of the situation. He was no stranger to tough times. After all, he'd survived the hardships of war, the loss of his beloved wife, and the passing of time that seemed to strip away everything he once held dear. But this? This was different. The sense of being mocked, of being belittled by someone young enough to be his grandchild, that was something new. Across the courtroom, Judge Donovan sat on his elevated platform, a young man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. He glanced down at George with a look of mild amusement, his pen tapping against the bench with an almost rhythmic precision. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, his voice dripping with condescension, "can you even understand the proceedings? Perhaps this is all a bit too much for someone of your age." The words hit George like a slap. His heart raced as he sat up straighter in his chair, struggling to suppress the feelings of humiliation swelling within him. But the judge wasn't done. "I can imagine that keeping up with all these legal terms must be quite overwhelming. Would you like me to slow down so you can catch up?" He chuckled, and a few members of the gallery joined in, their laughter echoing off the cold walls of the courtroom. The old man's eyes narrowed. He had been through much worse than this, and though the sting of mockery burned, he refused to let it show. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were all just waiting for him to crack. To lose his temper. But that wasn't his way. His entire life had been spent holding it together, no matter how hard it got. "I'm perfectly capable of understanding, Your Honor," George finally said, his voice steady, though a tinge of frustration lingered just beneath the surface. "But if you're so intent on making a mockery of me, perhaps it's you who should reconsider whether this is the right place for you." There was a sharp intake of breath from the gallery, and for a moment, even Judge Donovan seemed taken aback. His smile faltered, replaced by a brief flash of irritation. The power dynamic had shifted, albeit slightly. George had, if only for a second, regained some ground. "Enough, Mr. Miller," Judge Donovan snapped, his authority returning. "We'll continue. But be warned, any further disruptions, and I'll have you removed from the court." The tension in the room thickened. George was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. The case at hand was about more than just a legal dispute. The piece of land that George was fighting to keep was all he had left of his late wife, the woman he had loved for over 40 years. And now, it was being threatened by a corporate giant who had its sights set on tearing down everything George had worked for. They were willing to do whatever it took to take his property, no matter the cost. The corporate lawyers, sleek and well-dressed, sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. They exuded an air of confidence. No doubt they had handled hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like this. To them, George was just another obstacle. A relic from a bygone era, whose worth was as negligible as his chances of winning. And yet, here he was, determined to fight with everything he had left. As the proceedings dragged on, George tried to focus on the task at hand, despite the sting of the judge's words. The opposing counsel, a smug young attorney named Brandon Carver, began presenting evidence in favor of their claim. He was articulate, persuasive, and relentless in his attempts to portray George as an ignorant old man who didn't understand the modern world. "Your Honor," Carver said, with an air of superiority, "this land has no value to anyone but Mr. Miller, and he's holding it hostage. Our client has every right to develop this property, and Mr. Miller's objections are baseless." The words stung, but George's resolve only hardened. They could call him whatever they wanted, old, foolish, irrelevant. He had seen too much in his life to be shaken by their words. And yet, as the case continued, it became clear that the odds were stacked against him. The judge, while outwardly neutral, seemed to side with the corporate interests at every turn. He allowed the opposing side to present their evidence unchecked, while George's lawyer, an underfunded public defender who didn't seem to understand the case's gravity, struggled to keep up. As the hours wore on, George began to feel the weight of defeat pressing down on him. Maybe he was too old for this fight. Maybe he didn't have it in him anymore. His body ached from sitting too long, and his mind was weary. The mocking remarks from the judge echoed in his head, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if it was all worth it. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the door to the courtroom suddenly swung open, and a figure stepped into the room that none of them had expected. Clint Eastwood, yes, the Clint Eastwood, stood there, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the room. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the courtroom with a calm, calculating intensity. "Excuse me," Clint said, his voice as smooth as it was authoritative. "I believe I'm here to represent Mr. Miller." The room went silent. The judge blinked in surprise. The corporate lawyers exchanged puzzled glances. And George, for the first time that day, allowed himself a small, but hopeful, smile. Clint Eastwood, the legendary attorney, had just entered the courtroom, and with him, a glimmer of hope. The odds had just shifted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? George Miller wasn't always the man he appeared to be today. The man sitting in the courtroom, now with his shoulders a little slumped and hands shaking with age, was the same man who had once held his head high as a soldier, a husband, and a man of principles. But life had its way of humbling even the strongest, and George had learned that the hard way. His story began in a small, dusty town in the heart of Texas, where the scent of freshly baked pies and the sound of church bells ringing on Sundays were the backdrop to his childhood. George had been the only son of a hard-working couple. His father, a farmer, taught him the value of hard work from the moment he could walk. His mother, a gentle woman with a heart of gold, showed him the importance of kindness and respect for others. He was just 18 when the country called on him. The year was 1965, and the world was in turmoil. The Vietnam War was escalating, and the United States needed men to fight. George was one of those men. It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He loved his family, and leaving them behind was the hardest thing he'd ever done. But he felt a sense of duty, an obligation to serve. The war changed him. No one who served could walk away unchanged, and George was no exception. He came home a different man. His youth was gone, and with it, a part of his soul. But despite the horrors he'd witnessed, he carried a quiet dignity. He refused to let the darkness of war define him. Instead, he worked tirelessly to build a life he was proud of. He met Clara shortly after returning home. She was a schoolteacher, with a laugh that could light up a room and a kindness that matched her beauty. They were married within a year, and soon after, they built a small home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And for George, it was everything. They had no children of their own, but they had each other, and that was enough. Clara was his rock. Through the years, she helped him heal from the scars of war, though they were not always visible. There were sleepless nights, moments when the memories of battle would resurface in the middle of the night, and George would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. But Clara was there, always patient, always understanding. The years rolled by, and George found peace in the simple things. The smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees in the evening, the sight of Clara tending to her garden. They had no great wealth or status, but they had love, and for George, that was enough. That was until the day Clara passed away. The cancer had been swift and ruthless. One moment, Clara was fine, and the next, she was gone. It was a pain George had never anticipated. He thought he had prepared for it. After all, he had faced death in the war. But nothing prepared him for the hollow emptiness that followed Clara's death. After Clara's passing, George became a shell of the man he once was. He threw himself into caring for the land they had bought together, trying to keep it as a living memory of her. But as time passed, the loneliness grew. He had no children to pass the land down to, no family nearby. His friends had all moved away, or worse, passed on. The land was all he had left of his wife, and the thought of losing it felt like losing her all over again. It was that connection to the land, to the memories of Clara, that brought him to this point, standing in a courtroom, fighting for what was rightfully his, against a corporation that had no idea what it was like to lose everything. But as George sat in that cold courtroom, trying to steady his nerves, the mocking words of Judge Donovan echoed in his mind. The judge didn't know anything about George's life, his sacrifices, his pain. He didn't know that this land was more than just dirt and stone to George, it was a symbol of the life he and Clara had built together. It wasn't just a piece of property, it was his last connection to her. And George wasn't going to let some young, arrogant judge and a soulless corporation take that away from him. Not without a fight. When Clint Eastwood had walked into the courtroom, George hadn't known what to expect. Clint was a legend, but he was also a man with his own past, a past George didn't know about yet. But for the first time that day, George allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Clint Eastwood could be the key to turning things around. But George didn't fully understand what Clint represented, not yet. Clint wasn't just a skilled attorney. He was a man who had seen his own share of loss, who had battled his own demons, and who understood the true meaning of justice in a way few could. George's thoughts were interrupted as he glanced over at Clint, who was now sitting at the defense table, looking as calm as ever. It was hard to believe that a man like Clint Eastwood, who had seen the world change around him, had decided to step into a case like this. George had no idea what Clint's motivations were, but he knew one thing for sure, Clint was on his side, and that gave him a renewed sense of purpose. "Mr. Miller," Clint said, breaking George's reverie. "We're going to win this. I don't know how, but I've got a plan." George nodded, trying to hide the flicker of hope that was growing inside him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something worth fighting for, justice. The tension in the courtroom hung thick as the hours dragged on, and the case progressed with little hope for George Miller. The proceedings felt like a never-ending barrage of legal jargon, corporate sleaze, and relentless mocking from Judge Donovan. Every word from the judge seemed designed to undermine George, pushing him further into a corner. The corporate lawyers had been ruthless, and even his own attorney seemed overwhelmed by the weight of the case. But that was before Clint Eastwood had stepped in. Clint had an air of calm about him, a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. The gallery had gone silent when Clint had walked in, and that silence remained as he now quietly observed the courtroom dynamics. His sharp blue eyes never left the proceedings, his posture unwavering, like a man who had seen the storm before and knew how to weather it. "Your Honor," Clint finally spoke, his voice carrying through the room with quiet authority. "If I may, I'd like to make a statement." Judge Donovan's gaze flickered toward Clint, clearly irritated. "You've been given a chance to speak, Mr. Eastwood, but if you're simply going to repeat the same baseless arguments as your client, I suggest you save us all some time." Clint didn't flinch. He met the judge's eyes with a steady gaze. "No, Your Honor. I'm not here to repeat arguments. I'm here to present facts, and I intend to do so in a way that might just make you see this case from a different perspective." His voice was calm but firm, like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. The judge raised an eyebrow, but it was clear that he was taken aback. "Very well," he muttered, gesturing for Clint to proceed. "Let's see what you've got, Mr. Eastwood." Clint turned his attention back to the courtroom, but now there was a noticeable shift in the air. The corporate lawyers exchanged uncertain glances, and George, who had been slouching in his seat, sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. Clint wasn't just a figurehead in this case, He was about to take control of the narrative, and George could feel the momentum shifting in their favor. Clint stood and slowly made his way to the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He placed a stack of papers on the podium before him and turned to face the judge and the opposing attorneys. The calmness of his movements was unsettling in its precision. "Let's talk about this land," Clint began, his voice cutting through the tension. "You see, Your Honor, it's easy for people to dismiss George Miller as just another old man holding on to something that's no longer valuable. But what they fail to see, what they choose to ignore, is the history tied to this land." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The judge looked at him, somewhat intrigued, but the corporate lawyers barely concealed their dismissive smirks. Clint's eyes locked onto the judge. "This land, Your Honor, was purchased by Mr. Miller and his wife in 1974. It's not just a plot of dirt, it's the place where a man and woman built a life together. It's where they shared their dreams, their hopes, and their love. It's the last piece of their shared legacy, and it's a place that holds decades of memories. Do you think a man like Mr. Miller, a man who has fought in wars, who has built a life from nothing, who has lost so much, would just throw it all away for a quick payout from some faceless corporation? I don't think so." Clint's words hung in the air like a weighty truth, and for the first time that day, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Mr. Miller may be elderly, but don't mistake his age for weakness. His love for this land, for his late wife, Clara, is something that can't be measured by a bank balance or a corporate spreadsheet. The people who want to take this land from him, they're not interested in the story behind it. They're not interested in the legacy. All they care about is profit. The corporate lawyers, who had been so confident moments before, now sat a little straighter in their seats, their expressions faltering. They had underestimated George, and by extension, Clint Eastwood. "And if you think," Clint continued, his voice now more intense, "that this court is just a place to push around an old man who doesn't know better, then I suggest you think again. Mr. Miller might not have the same financial resources or flashy legal team as you do, but he has something that you can't take away from him, a righteous cause. And I'll fight for that cause, Your Honor, no matter what it takes." The room was still. No one spoke, and the silence hung between them like an unspoken challenge. George sat there, stunned by Clint's words. This wasn't just legal defense. This was something more, it was a declaration of war. Judge Donovan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had no choice but to acknowledge the weight of Clint's words. He cleared his throat. "I've heard enough. We will take a short recess before proceeding with the next phase of this case. Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Miller, I suggest you be prepared to present more than just emotional arguments when we reconvene." Clint didn't flinch. "I'll be ready, Your Honor. But this isn't just about emotions. It's about justice. And I'll make sure we get it." As the gavel came down, signaling the end of the session, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. The corporate lawyers, who had been so smug and self-assured just moments ago, now appeared rattled. They huddled together, their quiet voices filled with uncertainty. George couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope in his chest. Clint had done something he hadn't been able to, he had shown the court that this wasn't just about a piece of land, it was about something far deeper, something that money couldn't touch. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the trial had started, George felt like he had someone on his side who truly understood what he was fighting for. The courtroom was buzzing with a new energy after Clint Eastwood's impassioned defense. George Miller felt a sense of urgency stir within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just a fight for his land anymore. It was a fight for justice, a fight for everything he had lost, and above all, a fight for Clara's memory. As the recess came to an end, Clint motioned for George to approach him. The lawyers for the corporation, who had once seemed so self-assured, were now acting cautiously, whispering among themselves. The corporate bigwigs had underestimated Clint, and that was a mistake they'd soon regret. "Mr. Miller," Clint said in his gravelly voice, we need to be prepared for what's coming. The next phase of this trial is going to test both of us." George nodded, feeling the weight of his years and his past weighing down on him. He had never imagined himself in this kind of fight. All he had ever wanted was to live a quiet life, to tend to the land that held the memories of a love that had defined his world. But now, he was standing at the crossroads of something much bigger. He was fighting for what was right. Clint looked him in the eye. "You know, George, a fight like this is never just about the people involved. It's about something much bigger. It's about standing up against the forces that try to take away what's yours, just because they think they can." The words resonated with George. He had spent his life fighting for what he believed in, but this fight was different. This was no longer about surviving the daily grind or the physical hardships of farming. This was about something far deeper, something that had been ingrained in him since he was a young man, a sense of duty, a sense of justice. As the trial continued, Clint Eastwood's presence in the courtroom became more pronounced. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a strategist, carefully positioning each argument to dismantle the corporate lawyer's claims. George couldn't help but be in awe of Clint's skill, but he also couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. There was more at stake here than just legal victory. The land, Clara's legacy, his very sense of self was on the line. It was the next day when Clint came to George with a new plan. The trial was reaching its peak. The corporate lawyers had already made their move, and the judge had sided with them on several procedural matters. But Clint was undeterred. He had spent hours poring over every document, every detail of the case, and now, he was ready to take a bold step forward. "George, I've got a plan. It's risky, but it might just work," Clint said, his eyes gleaming with intensity. George leaned forward, eager to hear Clint's next move. Clint took a deep breath. The corporation is about to play their trump card. They're going to claim that the land is not legally protected, that it's just a piece of land without historical significance. They'll argue that it has no value beyond its immediate sale price. We can't let that happen. George's heart sank. He had known that the corporation would pull something like this. It wasn't just about the land. It was about erasing its value, stripping it of its meaning. Clint continued, "I'm going to call in a few witnesses. People who knew the land before it became this corporate battleground. People who can speak to its historical and emotional significance. And I'm going to bring in a few experts who can vouch for its environmental value. It's not just about what's on the surface. This land has a story, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it." George was overwhelmed but found strength in Clint's words. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of hope that they could win this fight. "Who are these witnesses?" George asked, his voice thick with emotion. Clint smiled. "You'll see soon enough." The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Clint made his move. He stood before the judge, his presence commanding attention. "Your Honor," Clint began, "I'd like to call my first witness, Mr. Daniel Cartwright." The doors to the courtroom opened, and an elderly man walked in slowly, supported by a cane. His weathered face was familiar to George, though he couldn't place him immediately. But as the man took his seat in the witness stand, George recognized him. Daniel Cartwright had been a neighbor to George and Clara for years. He was one of the few people who had shared in their lives, their struggles, and their joys. He had been there when George first bought the land, and he had helped George tend to the farm in the early days. Clint looked at Daniel, who was now adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. "Mr. Cartwright," Clint began, "can you tell the court what you remember about the land in question?" Daniel paused, his eyes focused on the judge. "Well, Your Honor," he began slowly, "I've known that piece of land for more years than I can count. I watched George and Clara build their life on it. It wasn't just dirt and grass, it was a place where memories were made. I helped them plant trees, harvest crops, and even fix the old barn. I've seen the love they had for that place, and I can tell you, it's not just any land. It means something. Clint nodded. And can you speak to the environmental value of the land? The corporation seems to believe it's just a piece of property that can be sold off. Daniel straightened up. That land's got something that money can't buy. It's got history, it's got life. It's part of the land we've been farming for generations. It's full of rare species, plants that you can't find anywhere else in this part of Texas. It's not just land, it's a living testament to what George and Clara worked for. The courtroom fell silent. George's heart raced as he listened to Daniel. The words struck a chord deep inside him, and for the first time, he felt like someone truly understood. This wasn't just about legal arguments, this was about the legacy that George and Clara had built. Clint's strategy was unfolding. With every witness he called, the corporate lawyers were beginning to lose their confident composure. They were starting to realize that this wasn't just about a sale. It was about something deeper, a battle for the soul of the land. The day's session ended, and George felt something stirring in his chest. For the first time since Clara's death, he felt alive with purpose. Clint had given him something he hadn't had in years, hope. And now, as the final phase of the trial loomed on the horizon, George knew that the battle was far from over. But with Clint by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The final days of the trial were upon them. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with an undercurrent of anticipation. It had become clear that Clint Eastwood had turned the tide in George Miller's favor, but the corporation wasn't going to back down easily. Now, they were preparing for their final push, and Clint was ready to counter them with everything he had. George couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for Clint. Over the past few days, Clint's cool-headed strategy had turned the courtroom into a battlefield, and George was fighting not just for land, but for his late wife's memory and the life they had shared. Every moment of this trial felt like a tribute to Clara, whose love had shaped everything George had worked for. But even with Clint's brilliance, George knew that the real battle was still ahead. The next phase of the trial was the most critical. The corporation would present their final arguments, and Clint would have one last chance to prove that George's land was not just another asset to be bought and sold. As the trial entered its final stretch, George began to feel the weight of the situation. The emotional toll of the trial had worn on him. He hadn't slept well, and every day had felt like an emotional roller coaster. But Clint, ever the stoic force, had a way of calming his nerves. Clint had seen it all before. This wasn't the first high-stakes trial he had faced. George could tell that Clint was preparing for something big, but he wasn't sure what. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final argument. The opposing attorneys stood confidently before the judge, their eyes scanning the room with an air of superiority. They had, after all, played their cards well. But Clint was unruffled. His composure hadn't wavered in the face of their aggression, and George could see that Clint was about to unleash his final move. Clint rose slowly from his seat, his expression unreadable. The room fell into a hush. It was time for the last stand. "Your Honor," Clint began, his voice steady but strong, "I'm not here to present more legal technicalities, more boring paperwork, or more corporate loopholes. I'm here to present a truth, the truth that this land, this place that Mr. Miller has fought for, is not just a piece of property. It's a piece of history." He turned to face the jury and the judge. "You've heard the arguments. You've heard the evidence. But there's something you haven't heard, something that's been missing from this entire trial. The emotional weight of this case is something the opposing counsel cannot and will not acknowledge. And that's why I'm here today." He paused, letting the words linger. Clint's eyes met George's, and for a brief moment, George could see a flicker of something in Clint's gaze, something more than just professional concern. It was empathy. Clint understood the emotional weight of the case, and he knew that this was the moment that could change everything. The land is not just dirt. It's not just the site of some financial transaction. It's the site of a life, the life that George and Clara Miller built together. And that is something that cannot be taken away. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the corporate lawyers had stopped whispering to one another. It was as if Clint had spoken a truth that they couldn't deny. Clint continued, his voice rising with passion. This land holds memories. It holds love, sacrifice, and history. It holds the very essence of what George and Clara stood for. When you try to take it away from him, you're not just taking property. You're erasing a part of his soul. You're erasing a part of this community's soul. George's heart was pounding. He had never felt such intensity before, such raw emotion in a courtroom. Clint wasn't just fighting for the land, he was fighting for George's dignity, for Clara's legacy. And, in that moment, George realized that Clint had done more than just help him. Clint had reminded him why he had been fighting in the first place. Now, Clint said, his voice now steady but filled with conviction, I understand that the opposing counsel has a legal argument. They'll argue that Mr. Miller's connection to the land isn't enough. But I ask you to consider this, what is a man's connection to his home? What is a community's connection to its land? It's not just about legal papers and contracts. It's about something much more powerful. It's about love, legacy, and the right to preserve something that matters. He turned to face the judge. Your Honor, we are not asking for mercy. We are asking for justice. We are asking that this court recognize the value of what we're fighting for, and the importance of standing up to the greed and corporate interests that want to destroy what's precious. Mr. Miller deserves to keep his land, not because it's the easy thing to do, but because it's the right thing. There was a long silence in the courtroom. The corporate attorneys stood frozen, clearly rattled by Clint's words. Judge Donovan, who had previously seemed so indifferent to the emotional elements of the case, now appeared to be deep in thought. For a moment, it felt as if time stood still. George could feel the weight of Clint's words sinking in. This wasn't just a fight for legal victory anymore. This was about something more profound, something that touched every person in the room. This was about what we stand for, about the legacy we leave behind, and about the bonds that tie us to the things that matter most. The judge's gavel came down, signaling the end of the session. The room was still. George sat in his seat, stunned. He had just witnessed the culmination of Clint's genius, a defense not just based on legal strategy, but on truth, emotion, and the very essence of what it meant to fight for what mattered. Clint turned to him with a faint smile. We've done everything we can, George. Now, it's up to them. The waiting was excruciating. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. George's heart raced as he thought about Clara, the life they had shared, and the legacy they had built together. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, he was fighting for his wife's memory, for everything they had worked for, and for the dignity that had always guided him. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the courtroom doors opened once again. The judge was ready to deliver his decision. The courtroom was eerily silent as Judge Donovan took his seat. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and the tension could be felt in every corner of the room. George Miller sat in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, his heart racing. He had fought tooth and nail for what he believed in, for the legacy of his late wife, Clara, and for the land that had been the cornerstone of their life together. Now, after days of grueling back and forth, it all came down to this one moment. Clint Eastwood sat beside him, a steady presence in the chaos of emotions. Clint's weathered face betrayed nothing. His cool composure had been his greatest asset throughout the trial, and now it was all George could rely on. He couldn't help but admire Clint's unwavering focus, even as his own thoughts swirled with doubt. Had they done enough? Was it really possible to win against such a powerful, wealthy corporation? The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. After careful consideration of the arguments presented by both parties, I have come to a decision. George's breath caught in his throat. He barely noticed the murmur of whispers around him, the nervous glances exchanged between the corporate lawyers, or even the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. All that mattered was what the judge would say next. Mr. Miller, after reviewing the legal evidence, and taking into account the emotional and historical value that was brought to light during this trial, I have ruled in your favor. The land in question will remain under your ownership, free from any corporate encroachment. For a moment, George couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words didn't fully register, and for a brief second, time seemed to stretch out impossibly. But then, as the weight of the decision began to sink in, he felt a wave of relief and gratitude rush over him. He turned to Clint, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "You did it, George," Clint said quietly. "You fought for what mattered." Tears welled up in George's eyes, but he fought them back. This victory wasn't just for him, it was for Clara, for their shared dreams, for everything they had worked for and cherished. He could almost feel Clara's presence beside him, as if she were standing there, her quiet strength and unwavering belief in their land and their life together guiding him through the darkest of times. George stood up slowly, his legs shaky but strong. He felt the weight of the moment, the weight of a journey that had taken him to places he never thought he would go. He had faced the loss of his wife, the threat of losing everything he had worked for, and the overwhelming pressure of a battle he had never imagined. And now, at this moment, he stood victorious. The courtroom erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. Some were applauding the legal victory, others were applauding Clint's brilliance, but George knew this moment wasn't just about the trial or the land. It was about something deeper, something that Clint had reminded him of during the course of this fight. Clint stood up beside George, his hand firmly on his shoulder. "It's over now," Clint said with a quiet satisfaction in his voice. "The battle's won, but don't forget, George, this isn't just a legal victory. This is a personal one." George nodded, finally feeling the weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. As the crowd began to disperse, George walked out of the courtroom with Clint by his side. The bright sunlight outside felt almost surreal after the tense days in the courtroom. The fresh air was a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside, and George took a deep breath, letting the cool breeze wash over him. Clint, as always, was the first to speak. "You did good, George. You kept your focus, and you fought for what was right. Not everyone would have had the courage to stand up like you did." George smiled faintly. "I had to. For Clara. For the land. For everything she and I built together." Clint looked at him with a nod. "You've got a lot of strength, George. More than you realize." George didn't respond right away. He simply walked beside Clint, letting the reality of the victory settle in. This wasn't just about keeping the land. It was about preserving the love and legacy that had defined his life, about honoring the woman who had been his rock, his partner, and his greatest love. Later that evening, George sat alone on the porch of his home, looking out over the land that had been the backdrop of his life. The golden light of the setting sun bathed the fields in a warm glow. It felt like Clara was there with him, as if she were standing next to him, sharing in the peace that had eluded him for so long. The battle had been won, and he could finally begin to heal. As he sat there, he thought about the journey he had been on. He had faced down a corporation that had tried to take everything from him. He had fought in a courtroom, against the odds and against the powerful forces that sought to crush him. But through it all, he had never lost sight of the most important thing, the love that had guided him all those years. And now, he had the chance to honor that love by keeping the land that had always been his and Clara's. Clint's voice broke through his thoughts. "I've seen a lot of people fight for a lot of things in my time, George, but you're one of the few who fought for something bigger than just yourself. You fought for love. And that's something to be proud of." George looked over at Clint, standing at the edge of the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Clint. You've been a true friend in all this. I don't think I could have faced the world without someone like you on my side." Clint grinned, flicking the ashes from his cigarette. "I just did my job, George. But I'm glad I could be here for you. George sat back in his chair, looking out at the horizon once more. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the land. He felt a quiet peace settle over him. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. For the first time in a long time, George felt like he could move forward. The days following the verdict were a blur of emotions for George Miller. It wasn't just the victory he was basking in, though that certainly had its place. No, it was the overwhelming sense of closure, of finality, that washed over him. The battle had been long, and it had taken everything from him, his strength, his resolve, his peace of mind. But it had also given him something profound, a new beginning. As he walked across the land that he had fought so fiercely to protect, George couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to the place. The earth beneath his boots, the wind rustling through the tall grass, the scent of the trees lining the horizon, it all felt so familiar, so right. Clara had loved this land, and he knew that in some way, she was still here with him. The trials they had faced together, the life they had built, and the love they had shared were forever etched into every inch of the land. George didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope stirring in his chest. The past had been painful, but it had also been a lesson, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from winning, but from holding on to what matters. Later that evening, Clint visited George at the farm. It had been a couple of days since the trial's conclusion, but Clint had not disappeared into the background like so many other lawyers might have. No, Clint had stayed in George's life, offering his presence and his support in a way that George never expected. The two of them sat on the porch together, the familiar silence hanging between them like an unspoken bond. "Everything settled, huh?" Clint said, breaking the quiet. George nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yeah. It feels like a weight's been lifted." Clint took a long drag from his cigarette, watching the smoke curl up into the evening air. "You know, most people would have folded under the pressure. But you stayed strong. You held on to what you believed in." George looked over at Clint, the gratitude clear in his eyes. "I had no choice. This land, it's everything I have left of Clara. I couldn't just give it up." Clint exhaled a puff of smoke, nodding in understanding. It wasn't just about the land, was it? It was about honoring her memory. About showing the world that love, real love, can't be bought or sold. George felt a lump form in his throat. It had been hard to put it into words, but Clint had understood perfectly. That was the one thing that George had always fought for, love. The love he had for Clara, the love they had shared, and the love that now lived in the land they had worked together. Clint's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've got a lot to look forward to now, George. You don't have to fight anymore. You can start living again." George looked out across the fields, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground. For a moment, he felt like he was seeing everything with new eyes. The landscape before him, the trees, the hills, the fields, it was all a symbol of the new beginning that was just within his reach. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to live. He was going to honor Clara's memory by rebuilding the life they had started together, and he was going to do it with dignity and strength. "I don't know what the future holds," George said quietly, "but I'm ready for it." Clint gave him a rare, sincere smile. "That's the spirit. And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." George nodded. It was a simple offer, but it meant the world. Clint had not only been his lawyer, he had been a friend, a mentor, and a guiding light during the darkest moments of his life. As Clint stood up to leave, he gave George a clap on the back. "Take care of yourself, George. You've earned this peace." Over the next few weeks, life on the farm slowly returned to a new kind of normal. George spent his days working the land, tending to the fields that Clara had loved so much. There were moments when he would catch himself thinking about her, remembering the way she used to laugh as they walked together, the way her hand had felt in his. But these memories didn't hurt the way they used to. Now, they brought him a sense of peace, a sense of closure. Clara's spirit was alive in the land, and in some small way, he could still feel her presence beside him. One afternoon, as George was walking along the property line, he saw a group of children playing near the creek that ran through the land. They were laughing and running through the tall grass, their carefree voices filling the air. George stopped for a moment, watching them with a soft smile on his face. For the first time since Clara's passing, he realized that life, despite its hardships, could still be beautiful. He had fought so hard to protect this land, not just for him, but for the future. For the next generation. It was then that George realized the true value of his victory. It wasn't just about keeping the land, it was about preserving it for those who would come after him. The fight had been worth it, not just for Clara, but for the legacy they had created together. Later that evening, as George sat down to dinner, a sense of contentment settled over him. He had come through the storm. The battle was over, and now, he had the chance to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be tough days ahead. But for the first time in a long time, George Miller felt a quiet confidence deep within himself. The future was his to shape, and he would do it with the same love and dedication that he had always given. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, George stood outside for a moment, looking up at the vast expanse above him. He had fought for what mattered, and he had won. He had honored Clara's memory, and in doing so, he had given himself a new beginning. And in that moment, George realized that sometimes, the greatest victories aren't about winning the battle, they're about finding the strength to start over, to build a new life, and to honor the things that truly matter. The days were starting to feel a little too quiet for George. The farm, once a bustling hub of activity with Clara by his side, now seemed vast and empty, as if echoing the emptiness inside him. Although he had won his battle, the victory didn't come without its consequences. There were no more courtrooms to fight in, no more legal jargon to navigate. It was just him now, and the land that he had fought so hard to keep. The work was endless, and yet, the silence weighed heavily on his heart. Just as he was about to stand up and head inside, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. George's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, the few neighbors he still had left were all far enough away that visits were few and far between. Curious, he stood up and walked toward the gate, his boots clicking on the dirt path. As the vehicle rolled into view, George's stomach sank. It was a sleek black SUV, the kind that rich, corporate lawyers drove. His pulse quickened, a gut feeling gnawing at him that this was far from a friendly visit. The SUV came to a stop, and the door opened. Out stepped none other than Evan Montgomery, the same corporate lawyer who had represented the company trying to seize his land. His smirk was as sharp and condescending as ever, and the sight of him sent a chill down George's spine. For a moment, he just stood there, watching Evan approach. The last time they had crossed paths, it had been in the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, but this time, there were no formalities. This was personal. "Mr. Miller," Evan said, his tone smooth, as if he had all the time in the world. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I just thought I'd pay you a visit." George felt his jaw tighten, his fists clenching at his sides. "What do you want, Montgomery?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Evan's smile never wavered. "I see you're still holding on to this place. Must be nice to think you've won. But, George, we both know the truth. You might have won in court, but you haven't won the war." George narrowed his eyes, a fire igniting in his chest. "What are you talking about?" "The court ruled in my favor." Evan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "The court's decision was merely a speed bump. You think the company's just going to back off? You've made a powerful enemy, Mr. Miller. And we're not the kind to let things go so easily." George's stomach churned. He'd known it wasn't over, but hearing it out loud from Evan's lips made it all too real. This wasn't just about land. This was about power, and Evan Montgomery had more than enough of it. "I'm not scared of you," George said, his voice firmer than he felt. Evan chuckled, a sound that grated on George's nerves. "You should be. The legal battle may be over, but there are other ways to make your life miserable. You wouldn't want something to happen to this place, would you?" He gestured toward the land surrounding them. George stood his ground, refusing to let the fear creep into his voice. "If you think I'm going to give up this land, you're wrong." Evan's smirk only widened. "We'll see. I'm just letting you know, you've made a mistake. One you'll regret." Without another word, Evan turned on his heel and got back into his SUV. As the vehicle drove off, George stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. The feeling of dread gnawed at him, but he refused to show it. He had fought too hard, and too long, to let a man like Evan Montgomery intimidate him now. Later that night, as George sat at the kitchen table, trying to steady his nerves, Clint's words echoed in his mind. "You've got a lot to look forward to now. You don't have to fight anymore." But how could George not fight? The battle for his land was far from over, and Evan's visit had made that painfully clear. George couldn't let his guard down, not now. He had won the trial, yes, but that didn't mean the fight was over. The shadow of Montgomery's corporation loomed over him like a storm cloud, and George couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. If the corporation was going to play dirty, then George needed to be prepared. He couldn't afford to lose everything again. But how would he fight back? He had already exhausted the legal route. And even if he could afford another trial, it wasn't just about the law. The company had endless resources, and George knew he was just a small player in their game. The battle was bigger than he realized, and now, it felt more personal than ever. As the days went by, George's anxiety grew. His every move was shadowed by a sense of impending danger. He couldn't let his guard down for a second. He started taking extra precautions around the farm, checking locks, securing gates, even installing new security cameras. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was the only thing he could do to feel somewhat in control. One evening, just as George was about to turn in for bed, he received a phone call. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver. "Hello." It was Clint's voice on the other end. "George, we need to talk." "About what?" George asked, already feeling the weight of the conversation. "I've been doing some digging," Clint said, his voice serious. "And I've got some news. The company hasn't given up on your land. They've got a bigger plan in motion. And it's not good." George felt the air in his lungs freeze. He had known it wasn't over, but hearing Clint confirm his worst fear made it real. "What do you mean?" George asked, his voice tight. Clint didn't mince words. "They've got people working behind the scenes. I don't know exactly what they're planning, but I can tell you this, it's bigger than just taking your farm. They want to break you, George. They're going to use every dirty trick in the book to do it." George's heart raced. The shadows had returned, and this time, they were closer than ever. George spent the following days in a daze, unable to shake the weight of Clint's warning. It wasn't just the unease that gnawed at him now, it was the uncertainty. Every decision, every action seemed fraught with danger. He knew Montgomery's corporate machine was ruthless, but he had underestimated the lengths they were willing to go to. He had thought that winning the trial would be the end of it. That it would be a moment to finally breathe and rebuild. Instead, it felt like it was just the beginning of something much darker. That morning, George stood outside the farmhouse, staring out over the land. The sky was a pale blue, and the sun was already climbing higher. It should have been a peaceful morning. But it wasn't. The sense of impending dread hung over him like a storm cloud. His hand clenched into a fist as he gazed at the property that had been in his family for generations. He couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after everything he had fought for. But he also knew that the fight ahead would require more than just legal maneuvering. It would require strategy, cunning, and maybe even alliances he hadn't considered before. He had to outsmart them. Later that afternoon, Clint arrived at the farm, his face grim as he stepped out of his car. George had asked him to come by to discuss what the next steps should be. He knew Clint was more than just a lawyer, he was a man of action, someone who had been through the trenches and had a mind for strategy. But George couldn't shake the feeling that even Clint didn't have all the answers this time. "Clint," George greeted him, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's the news?" Clint didn't mince words. "It's worse than I thought, George. Montgomery's people are already in motion. They've got private investigators, they've got people looking into every detail of your life. You're not just a farmer to them anymore. You're a target." George's heart sank. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing Clint confirm it made it real. "So what do we do? I can't just sit around and wait for them to attack." Clint's eyes hardened. "No, you can't. And you won't. But we need to be careful. We need to play this smart. The last thing we want is to be blindsided." George nodded, frustration bubbling up inside him. "I'm not going to let them take what's mine. I've already lost enough." Clint stepped closer, his voice low. "And I'm not going to let them break you. But this isn't just about the land anymore, George. This is about survival. We need to anticipate their next move." That night, as George lay awake in bed, his thoughts raced. Clint had given him a plan, a few solid steps they could take to protect the farm and start fighting back. But George knew it wasn't enough. The corporate machine they were up against was massive, and he had only so many resources to fight with. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He needed more than just a lawyer and a plan. He needed allies. Real allies. People who understood the fight they were up against, people who were willing to risk everything for the cause. And that meant reaching out to people he had never considered before. People like his neighbors. People who had lived through hard times and fought their own battles. The next morning, George made the call. He started with Sam, a neighbor who had lived down the road for as long as George could remember. Sam was a grizzled man in his late 60s, with a sharp wit and a no-nonsense attitude. He'd been through his own fair share of struggles, and George knew he could count on him. "Sam, it's George," he said when the phone was answered. "We need to talk." A few days later, Sam showed up at George's house, along with a few other local farmers who George knew had been struggling with their own fights against large corporations. George had called in favors, reaching out to those he knew would stand with him. Together, they gathered in George's living room, ready to discuss their next steps. "All right," George began, looking around at the group. "We're in a fight, and it's a fight we can't win alone. Montgomery and his people aren't going to stop, but we don't have to sit back and let them bulldoze us. We fight smart. We fight together." Sam nodded, his weathered face serious. "You're right, George. I've been watching the big companies eat up farms like ours for years. They don't stop until there's nothing left. But we can't just roll over. If we stand together, we've got a chance." The others agreed, their faces determined. It was clear that this wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about preserving their way of life. Their livelihoods. Their legacy. Over the next few weeks, George and his new allies worked tirelessly, using every tool at their disposal to gather information on Montgomery's operations. They set up surveillance, investigated his financial backers, and started making plans to put the pressure back on the corporation. But it wasn't easy. Every move they made felt like it was being watched, and George couldn't shake the feeling that Montgomery had eyes everywhere. The tension reached a boiling point one night when George received an anonymous tip. Someone had spotted a group of men from the corporation on his property, late at night, snooping around the fields and taking pictures. George knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't let them intimidate him into submission. That night, he and Sam decided to confront the trespassers. With flashlights in hand, they headed out into the fields, careful to stay low. They didn't know what they'd find, but they knew it wouldn't be good. As they approached the far corner of the property, George's heart pounded in his chest. The rustling of the leaves in the wind sounded like a warning. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. They had to get this right. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of the men from Montgomery's team, his face obscured by a hood. George's instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, grabbing the man by the arm and pulling him toward the light. "What are you doing on my land?" George demanded, his voice low and steady. The man struggled, but George's grip was unyielding. Sam stepped forward, his face hard as stone. "Answer him." The man stopped struggling, his eyes darting around nervously. I don't know what you're talking about. We were just lying," George interrupted. "You're on my property without permission. You've been spying on me. What's your game?" The man swallowed hard. "We're just doing our job. Montgomery wants to make sure the land's still intact. He needs to know what you're up to." George's blood boiled. It was a warning, and George had no intention of backing down. "This land is mine," George said, his voice steely. "And I won't let you or anyone else take it from me." Sam stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You tell Montgomery we're not afraid of him. We'll fight for what's ours." The man nodded quickly, clearly eager to get away. "Fine. Just don't do anything stupid. Montgomery doesn't play fair." With that, he turned and ran back into the darkness, leaving George and Sam standing together, the weight of the battle ahead heavy on their shoulders. The days that followed George's confrontation with the corporate spies were a blur of tension and anticipation. The group of farmers that George had rallied together worked tirelessly to keep a watchful eye on the land. Sam, who had been a seasoned fighter in his own right, took the lead in organizing their efforts. He was resourceful, familiar with the ropes of rural living and the ins and outs of dealing with corporations that saw the land as nothing more than a financial asset to be devoured. Even with their combined efforts, George couldn't shake the feeling that something even darker was on the horizon. Montgomery's corporation was like an octopus, its tentacles reaching out in every direction. But George wasn't about to let them suffocate him, not after everything he had fought for. One particularly cold morning, George found himself alone in the farmhouse kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He hadn't been able to sleep much the night before, his mind a constant whirl of plans and contingencies. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When George opened it, he was surprised to see Emily Foster standing on his porch. Emily was the town's former mayor, a woman with a sharp mind and a reputation for getting things done. But after her tenure, she had largely stayed out of politics, keeping a low profile. George had never been particularly close to her, but he respected her. Emily wasn't the type of person who came around unless something serious was at stake. "George," Emily said, her eyes serious, "we need to talk." George stepped aside, letting her into the house. "What brings you by, Emily?" Emily wasted no time. "I've been hearing things," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. "People in town are scared. They've heard rumors about Montgomery's plans, and they're not good. I think it's time we took action." George's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of action?" Emily met his gaze squarely. "The town has power. Not just through politics, but through its people. You have allies in town, George. People are willing to fight. But we need to be strategic. We need to show Montgomery that we're not going to be pushed around." George felt a surge of hope, and something else. A sharp sense of urgency. "What do you suggest?" "I've been talking to some people who are still on the inside of Montgomery's operation," Emily said. "I have information. A lot of it. George leaned in. What kind of information? Emily looked around cautiously, as if she was worried someone might overhear them. It's about their next move. They're trying to get their hands on more land, but they're also planning a series of hostile takeovers. If they can break the smaller farms, they'll have a clear shot at taking over the whole region. But there's something else, something bigger that's going to happen soon. George's stomach twisted. He had expected Montgomery to be ruthless, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. What's the plan? I can't say everything right now, Emily replied, but I'm working on getting more intel. The thing is, we can't wait around for them to make the first move. We need to be proactive. If we fight back now, we stand a better chance of stopping them before it gets worse. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and planning. Emily had set up a series of secret conversations with several former allies of Montgomery who had switched sides. Some were employees who had become disillusioned with the corporation, while others were local businessmen who had felt the pressure from Montgomery's growing influence. One of them, a former contractor named Danny who had worked with the company on infrastructure projects, had some particularly useful information. Danny told them about a large shipment of equipment that Montgomery's company was planning to send to the region, equipment that could be used to expand their operations on the land they were trying to seize. This was their opening. If they could intercept this shipment, they could stall the corporation's plans for weeks, maybe even months. George knew they had to act quickly. If Montgomery realized what was going on, they would be prepared. But if they were able to pull it off, it would give them the breathing room they needed to solidify their defenses and begin organizing their next steps. Clint, who had been silent during much of the planning, spoke up one evening. We need to get ahead of this. We can't just be reactive anymore. If we want to survive, we need to hit them where it hurts. George nodded. I agree. We're not just defending anymore. We're fighting back. The plan was set in motion. Under the cover of night, George and his allies made their move. They'd learned that the shipment would be passing through a remote stretch of highway, about an hour outside of town. Clint had arranged for a few trusted individuals to block off key roads and create distractions, while George, Emily, Sam, and a few others would intercept the convoy. It was a dangerous plan, but they were running out of options. The stakes had never been higher. As the convoy approached, George's heart pounded in his chest. He was perched on a hilltop, waiting for the signal from Clint. The wind rustled through the trees, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around them. It was eerily quiet, except for the distant rumble of the convoy approaching. When Clint's signal came, a flash of light from a nearby hill, George and the others sprang into action. The first truck in the convoy was forced to stop as a roadblock appeared ahead of them. The drivers were taken by surprise, their hands shaking as they tried to assess the situation. Everyone, stay calm, George said, keeping his voice steady. We just want to talk. We're not here to hurt anyone, but we need to send a message. Montgomery's operation won't be running over this land. Not anymore. The drivers, confused and frightened, hesitated. Sam and a couple of the farmers moved quickly to disable the trucks, while George and Emily made their way toward the lead vehicle. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Within minutes, they were surrounded by Montgomery's security team, armed and ready to fight back. Tension hung thick in the air. But just as George thought the situation was about to spiral into violence, he heard a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Let them go, Clint said, stepping forward with a look of authority. I've got this covered. The security team hesitated. Clint had leverage. They knew it, and George could see it in their eyes. It was the moment they had been waiting for, a critical negotiation point. Clint's presence was like a sharp blade cutting through the tension. This shipment isn't going anywhere, and neither is Montgomery's plan. You tell your boss that this land will never belong to him. The confrontation was intense, but in the end, it worked. The convoy was forced to turn back, their mission thwarted. And for the first time in weeks, George felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the understanding that the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The victory of thwarting Montgomery's shipment sent a ripple through the small town. News spread quickly, carried by word of mouth from neighbor to neighbor, farmer to farmer. For the first time in weeks, the collective tension began to ease. People who had once been too afraid to speak openly about Montgomery's plans started to stand tall. They had seen George and his allies take action, and it inspired them to believe that there might still be hope. But George knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. Montgomery was no fool. He would not let this setback go unanswered. The corporation was ruthless, and George had no doubt that they were already strategizing their next move. It wasn't long before the retaliation began. One early morning, George woke to the sound of his phone buzzing violently on the nightstand. He grabbed it, squinting at the caller ID. It was Clint. George's heart skipped a beat. "Clint. What's going on?" George answered quickly. "George, we've got trouble." Clint's voice was grim, cutting through the fog of sleep. "Montgomery's people are on the move. And they've just taken a shot at us." George's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, taken a shot?" "There's a group of them parked right outside town, on the outskirts of your property. They've been watching us, trying to intimidate us. But this morning, they crossed the line. They sent a message." Clint's words settled like lead in George's chest. "What kind of message?" "Gunfire," Clint said bluntly. "We don't know exactly who they are, but they're armed and dangerous. They've got the full force of Montgomery's resources behind them, and they're not afraid to use it. We need to take action, George." George's hands trembled. He hadn't been prepared for this. A physical threat, an assault, was something he had never considered. Up until now, everything had been legal battles, subterfuge, and tense negotiations. But this? This was different. "I'll be right there," George replied, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. George and Clint met at the farmhouse in the early afternoon. Sam and a few of the other farmers had gathered as well, waiting for the next move. Clint had already begun assembling their defense strategy, but the weight of the situation had changed everything. They weren't just defending land anymore, they were defending their lives. "We can't keep doing this on our own," Clint said, looking over the group. "We need to escalate things, but we also need to be smart. Montgomery is trying to push us into a corner, hoping we'll back down. The more we resist, the harder they're going to hit." George knew Clint was right. But what other choice did they have? The people of the town had already put themselves on the line. There was no going back now. "We need to make a stand," George said, his voice unwavering. "If we give in now, they'll take everything. This is our chance to send a message." Clint looked him in the eyes. "A stand? You're talking about playing their game, George. But we need to fight smarter. We can't just go toe-to-toe with them." "I'm not suggesting we go to war," George replied. "But we need to show them we won't be intimidated." Over the next few days, they implemented a new strategy. George and Clint began rallying even more allies, reaching out to anyone who had a vested interest in stopping Montgomery. They turned to the press, feeding them information about the ongoing harassment and threats. George knew the media could be a powerful weapon. It was time to turn the spotlight on Montgomery and make their actions public. Emily had continued to provide crucial intel, working behind the scenes to expose more of Montgomery's corrupt practices. The town's collective strength was beginning to take shape. Local businesses that had once been silent about the growing power of Montgomery started to speak out. George realized that he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Montgomery had underestimated the resolve of the people who called this place home. But even with their plans in motion, the threat of violence lingered. George's nerves were on edge. They had set up security measures, increased patrols on the property, and doubled down on the surveillance of Montgomery's activities. Every movement was scrutinized. But none of that could prepare him for the next thing that came their way. The phone rang again late one evening. George was in the living room, reviewing documents with Clint, when he saw the call. It was from Emily. He knew something was wrong as soon as he heard her voice on the other end. "George, they're coming," Emily said urgently. "Montgomery has mobilized his forces. They're going to make a move tonight." "What do you mean, make a move?" George asked, his voice tight. "Everything's been set in motion. I just found out they've sent a crew out to burn down a few barns on your property. They're trying to break your spirit. They're trying to break you, George. We need to stop them." George's stomach dropped. This was the last thing he had expected, but it made sense. A direct assault, a message designed to hit him where it hurt the most, his livelihood. "We won't let them get away with this," George said, barely able to suppress the anger in his voice. "How much time do we have?" "Not long. They've been spotted near the north entrance of the farm. You need to get there now." George, Clint, Sam, and the others rushed to the farm's north entrance, moving quickly and quietly under the cover of night. They were ready. The town had rallied behind them, and they would not allow Montgomery to destroy what they had built. The sight of flames and the smell of smoke began to fill the air as they approached the barns. The glow from the fires lit up the night sky in a haunting orange hue. As they crept closer, George could hear voices, low and menacing. The attackers were setting fire to the barn. George's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his head down, signaling to the others to move closer. The plan was simple: stop the fire before it spread, and make sure the men responsible didn't get away. It was an act of defiance, but George wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had left him. When they were within range, Clint gave the signal. The group stormed forward, armed with fire extinguishers and determined to put out the flames. The attackers, caught off guard, turned to flee. George and Sam chased after them, forcing them into a corner where they couldn't escape. "You've made a big mistake," George said, his voice cold as the attackers realized they were trapped. "We weren't the ones who made the mistake," one of the men sneered. "Montgomery's got the whole town in his pocket. You won't win this fight." "Maybe you're right," George replied, his gaze hard. "But I'm not going down without a fight." The authorities arrived shortly after, taking the men into custody. The fire was contained, and the barns were saved. George stood there, watching the smoke rise into the night sky. He felt a sense of victory, but it was bittersweet. Montgomery had drawn first blood, but they had just proven that they were not easily intimidated. The days following the fire were strangely quiet. The townspeople, though shaken by the events, took solace in the fact that George and his team had managed to thwart Montgomery's attempt to destroy their property. The barns, while slightly damaged, were still standing, a symbol of resilience. Yet, in George's heart, he knew that this peace was only temporary. Montgomery wouldn't let this setback go unanswered. He would escalate the situation further, and George had to be ready. As the town went about its daily routines, the tension still lingered. George knew that Montgomery would use the full weight of his resources to crush any resistance. This wasn't just about land anymore, it was about power. And George was standing in the way. Emily continued to be a valuable ally, feeding them crucial intelligence about Montgomery's movements. She had uncovered something that could be a game-changer, a legal loophole in Montgomery's dealings that could be used against him in court. But getting it to the right people would take time they might not have. One evening, as George sat alone in the farmhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The air was thick with anticipation. A storm, both literal and figurative, was on the horizon. The phone rang again. It was Clint. "George, we need to talk," Clint said, his voice urgent. "What's going on?" George asked, sitting up straight, his mind racing. "I've been keeping an eye on Montgomery's operation. They've been moving something big. I think they're planning another attack, but this time, it's going to be different." "Different how?" George asked, already dreading the answer. Clint paused before responding, the silence stretching between them. "They're planning to bring in more muscle. I've got word that Montgomery is bringing in outside security. Mercenaries. If we don't act fast, they'll overwhelm us." George's heart sank. Mercenaries? This wasn't just a local fight anymore. Montgomery was bringing in professionals. It was a game changer. George realized that this time, it wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about survival. "We need to get to the town council," George said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "We need to warn them, rally the town, and prepare for this. If Montgomery thinks he can bring in mercenaries and scare us into submission, he's in for a rude awakening." Clint agreed. "I'll meet you there. We need to make sure everyone's ready." At the town hall meeting that evening, the atmosphere was tense. The small, wooden building had seen its fair share of heated debates, but tonight felt different. The farmers, business owners, and concerned citizens had all gathered to discuss the growing threat of Montgomery's corporation. George stood at the front, speaking to the crowd. "Folks, we've been through a lot in the past few weeks, but I'm afraid it's not over. Montgomery is upping the stakes. He's bringing in mercenaries, professionals who are going to try to take us down, one way or another. But we're not going to back down. We've come too far, and we've already proven that we're stronger than they think." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. George could see the fear in their eyes, but also a spark of defiance. They were ready to fight. Emily stood up, adding, "We've got legal resources on our side, too. We can push back in the courts, but we need to be ready for whatever they throw at us. This isn't just about land. It's about our future, our homes, and our families." The meeting went late into the night, strategizing their next moves. They agreed to bolster their defenses, both legal and physical. The local militia, made up of farmers, hunters, and former military members, began training in preparation for an assault. George and Clint worked on securing more resources, reaching out to their allies to gather everything they could in terms of both intelligence and supplies. Still, despite the unity that was building, there was an underlying tension. George knew they were walking a fine line. One wrong move could ignite an even larger conflict. The following week, as George was reviewing documents in his office, Clint stopped by with urgent news. "It's happening, George," Clint said, his face tight with worry. "They're moving in. We've spotted a convoy of armed men heading this way." George stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "It's time to make our stand." The town prepared for battle, knowing that the mercenaries were coming in full force. George had anticipated Montgomery's next move, and although they were outnumbered, they had one thing Montgomery didn't: the land and the hearts of the people. The unity among the townspeople was palpable. Everyone had a stake in this fight, and they were willing to defend what was theirs. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of town, George, Clint, Sam, and Emily were waiting, positioned on a high vantage point, watching as the trucks rolled into view. It wasn't just a few men. The convoy stretched for miles, filled with heavily armed mercenaries. They had come prepared for war. "Stay low," Clint instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't want to engage unless we have to." George nodded, his mind racing. He knew that this could be their last chance to stop Montgomery. If the mercenaries broke through their defenses, the town could be lost. As the convoy neared, George gave the signal, and the first line of defense was activated. The militia had set up roadblocks, making it impossible for the mercenaries to advance without taking a detour. Meanwhile, others had strategically placed cameras and traps in the surrounding woods to disorient the invaders. But just as George thought they might have a chance to force Montgomery's men into retreat, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It was Emily. "They've got snipers," she said, her voice urgent. "We've got to move fast, or we're going to lose the high ground." The next few hours felt like a blur. Gunfire echoed in the distance as the mercenaries began to engage with the militia. The sound of shouting, the crackle of radios, and the constant rush of adrenaline made everything feel surreal. George's heart raced as he coordinated with Clint, Sam, and Emily to keep the mercenaries on the defensive. They were fighting with everything they had, and despite the odds, they were holding their ground. The snipers were a constant threat, but they had learned to anticipate their moves, using the terrain to their advantage. And just when it seemed like Montgomery's forces were going to break through, the town's biggest asset made an appearance, the press. Emily had alerted a few journalists who had been covering the case, and their arrival had changed everything. Cameras flashed as they captured the confrontation between the town's militia and Montgomery's mercenaries. The world was watching. The victory over Montgomery's mercenaries felt like a brief reprieve, momentary flash of hope amidst the shadows of impending danger. As the mercenaries retreated and the town celebrated, George knew that their small victory would only serve to escalate Montgomery's anger. He had survived this first wave, but the real battle was still ahead. The question was no longer whether he could defend his land but whether he could stop Montgomery for good. In the days following the battle, the town's spirit was undeniably stronger. People talked openly about the fight, sharing stories of bravery and unity. They began to believe that their resistance could truly make a difference. But behind George's calm exterior, there was something gnawing at him, the realization that victory had come with a price. Their small town had managed to hold off an army, but at what cost? The mercenaries had come for the land, but they hadn't left without leaving scars. The infrastructure had been damaged, the spirit of fear had infiltrated the minds of some, and worse, George had the sinking feeling that Montgomery's retaliation would only grow more ruthless. One evening, after the excitement had settled, George sat down with Clint at the farmhouse, the two men surrounded by maps and legal documents. George felt the weight of the moment, the gravity of what they had fought for and what they had yet to face. "We've won this round, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods," Clint said, his eyes narrowed with concern as he looked at George. "Montgomery isn't going to forget this, George. He'll come back harder. The kind of power he wields. He won't let this be the end." "I know," George replied, his voice heavy. "He'll come after us again. He's already trying to make his next move. We need to be ready for whatever he throws our way." The room fell into a tense silence as George thought back to the day when Montgomery first set his sights on their town. At the time, it had seemed like an abstract threat, something he could manage with the right legal maneuvers, a couple of good arguments, and a lot of paperwork. But the stakes had changed. Now, the fight was personal. It wasn't just about land. It was about their lives, their homes, their families. "There's something else we need to think about," Clint said, breaking George from his thoughts. "We've been lucky so far, but our allies are stretched thin. Some of the farmers and business owners are already starting to question if they've bitten off more than they can chew. They've got families to protect. They don't want to put themselves in danger." George felt a pang of guilt at Clint's words. He knew that many of the town's people had risked everything, putting their livelihoods on the line. The reality of their situation was becoming clearer every day. The longer they fought, the more lives would be affected, and the harder it would be to keep everyone united in their cause. "We can't afford to lose anyone," George said, his voice grim. "If we're going to win this, we need to make sure everyone stays in the fight. We need more allies. More support." Clint nodded. "I've got some contacts who might be able to help. They're not local, but they've been through similar fights. I'll reach out to them. The next morning, George and Clint gathered the town's leaders once more to discuss their next steps. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. As George walked into the town hall, he could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just about fighting Montgomery anymore, it was about preserving everything they had worked for. Their town, their homes, their future. We've all seen what Montgomery is capable of, George began, addressing the group. He's not going to let this go. But we've proven that we can stand together and fight. We're not just fighting for our land. We're fighting for our future. And we have to ask ourselves, what price are we willing to pay for that future? The room fell silent as everyone took in his words. George could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the fear that had been buried beneath the surface now rising to the forefront. But even in the face of fear, he saw something else, determination. They were ready to do whatever it took. We need more than just defense, George continued. We need to take the fight to Montgomery. We can't keep playing defense while he continues to grow stronger. We need to find a way to hit him where it hurts. Emily stood up from her seat, her voice steady but filled with conviction. I've been working on that. There's more information that we can use against Montgomery. We've found financial irregularities, unethical practices, things that could lead to a bigger scandal. If we can expose this, we can hit him in the only place that matters to him, his wallet. George felt a spark of hope. It was a small victory, but it was something they could use to their advantage. That's exactly what we need, Emily. We need to bring the fight to the courts and the press. If we expose Montgomery's corruption, we can rally public opinion on our side. Clint nodded. I'll start reaching out to some legal experts. We'll need the best if we're going to make this work. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Emily worked tirelessly to compile the evidence against Montgomery, digging deeper into his financial records, business dealings, and connections to powerful politicians. Meanwhile, Clint reached out to lawyers who specialized in corporate corruption, hoping to find someone who could help them build a case strong enough to take Montgomery down. George spent his days strategizing with Sam and the other town leaders, preparing for the inevitable next move. He knew Montgomery wouldn't just give up. He would come after them again, harder than before. But this time, they were going to be ready. They would fight on all fronts, in the courts, in the media, and on the ground. As the days wore on, George's anxiety began to mount. The legal battles, the press, the constant vigilance, it was wearing on him. The town had come together to fight for their future, but every day brought new challenges. There were whispers of Montgomery's next move, rumors of new alliances forming in the shadows, and George couldn't help but wonder if they were truly prepared for what lay ahead. It was late one evening when Clint called with news that would change everything. George, you need to come to the office. We've got a lead. A big one. When George arrived at Clint's office, he was met with a sight that filled him with both hope and dread. Emily, Clint, and Sam were gathered around a table, poring over a series of documents. We've got something, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something that could bring Montgomery down for good. George leaned over the table, his heart pounding. What is it? It's a massive offshore account, Clint explained. Montgomery's been funneling money through a network of shell companies. And we've got access to the records. If we can prove that this money was obtained through illegal means, we can take him down in one fell swoop. George's pulse quickened. This was it. This was their chance to finally end Montgomery's reign of terror. But the weight of the responsibility was crushing. If they went public with this information, there would be no turning back. Are we ready for this? George asked, his voice steady but filled with an edge of uncertainty. If we expose this, Montgomery will retaliate. He'll come after us harder than ever before. We're ready, Clint replied, his voice resolute. We've come this far, George. We can't stop now. As George sat in his office the next morning, staring at the pile of documents Emily had meticulously compiled, the reality of the situation began to set in. This was it. The moment they had all been waiting for. The evidence against Montgomery was undeniable, but George knew this was just the first hurdle. Winning in court would be no easy task. Montgomery had connections, money, and power. He could throw every resource he had at them to win. Clint walked into the office with a grim expression, his face betraying the gravity of the news he had just received. "George," Clint began, his voice low, "we need to prepare ourselves. I've just heard from a reliable source, Montgomery is pulling every string he can. He's hired the best defense lawyers money can buy. They're not going to play fair." George sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I know. But we can't back down now. If we don't take him on in court, we'll lose everything. We have to make this count." The court date was set, and the town buzzed with anticipation. Word spread quickly that Montgomery was finally going to be held accountable for his shady dealings. But while the people of the town were hopeful, George couldn't help but feel a knot in his stomach. The opposition was powerful, and they had already shown their willingness to do whatever it took to crush him. The morning of the trial, George stood outside the courthouse with Clint, Emily, and Sam. They had gathered every shred of evidence they could, from the financial records to the testimonies of those who had been wronged by Montgomery. But they knew it wouldn't be enough to rely solely on facts and figures. They had to make an impact. The people of the town had to see this trial as a fight for justice, a fight they could all be a part of. "We're not just fighting for land, George," Emily said, her voice filled with conviction. "We're fighting for something bigger. For fairness, for integrity, for the future of this town." George nodded, looking up at the courthouse, where reporters were already gathering. "We have to win this, for all of us. But even more than that, we have to make sure Montgomery never forgets that we're not just a small town. We're a community. And we won't back down." Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The prosecution and defense were preparing for what would be a long and grueling trial. Montgomery's legal team was as slick and polished as expected, but George had something they didn't, the truth. He had seen too many lives destroyed by Montgomery's greed to back down now. As the trial began, George took a deep breath. He was about to face Montgomery in the fight of his life. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, local residents, and even some out-of-town investors who had been following the case. George's team sat at one table, and across from them, Montgomery's legal team huddled, preparing their strategy. The judge, a stern middle-aged man named Judge Harper, called the court to order. "This is a case of corporate corruption and land disputes," he said, looking over the papers before him. "The evidence presented will determine the outcome of the case. We will begin with the prosecution's opening statement." The prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer named Claire Jacobs, stood up and addressed the court. She was a no-nonsense attorney, well known for her work in corporate corruption cases, and had agreed to take on this case pro bono. George had no doubt that she was their best shot. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice firm and confident, "today, you will hear how Montgomery Enterprises has manipulated the system to defraud hard-working citizens of their land, their livelihoods, and their dignity. This case is about more than just land ownership, it's about greed, exploitation, and the abuse of power. We have irrefutable evidence that Montgomery and his associates have been involved in a series of illegal activities, and it's time they answer for it." George sat quietly as Claire laid out the case against Montgomery. She spoke of the hidden offshore accounts, the fraudulent land deals, and the illegal practices that had destroyed families and businesses across the region. It was a powerful opening, and George couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rise within him. For the first time, he felt like they had a chance. Montgomery's defense attorney, a slick, well-dressed man named Richard Granger, stood up to give his opening statement. His demeanor was calm, collected, and confident. It was clear that he had been in the business of defending the wealthy for a long time. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began smoothly, what you will hear in this courtroom is a collection of half-truths and misunderstandings. My client, Mr. Montgomery, has built a successful business empire through hard work and perseverance. He has made a tremendous contribution to this region, employing hundreds of people and boosting the local economy. The charges brought against him are nothing more than an attempt to discredit his success. This is not a case of corruption, it's a case of people trying to take what they couldn't earn on their own. As Granger spoke, George could feel the weight of his words pressing down on him. The man was skilled, and his argument was dangerous. He knew that Granger would stop at nothing to turn the jury against them. But George wasn't going to let Montgomery's lies win. The trial continued for weeks, with both sides presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and engaging in heated cross-examinations. The tension in the courtroom was thick. Every time Montgomery's team tried to undermine their case, George and his team fought back harder. Emily's evidence, Clint's legal insights, and Sam's testimony about the impact of Montgomery's actions on the community all played a crucial role in making their case stronger. But the defense was relentless. They painted George as a man driven by personal vendetta, someone who was using the legal system to exact revenge. They tried to discredit the witnesses, questioning their motives, their credibility, and their knowledge. It seemed like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. And then, just when things seemed like they were starting to tilt in Montgomery's favor, Clint pulled off a move that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Clint had managed to uncover a crucial piece of evidence that no one had anticipated. While reviewing Montgomery's financial records, he had found a transaction that linked Montgomery directly to the illegal offshore accounts, a transaction that Montgomery had tried to hide in a web of shell companies. It was the smoking gun they needed. Clint presented the evidence in court, and the room fell silent. The defense tried to argue that it was a mistake, but the evidence was undeniable. The transaction was real, and it was damning. George could see the change in Montgomery's demeanor. The confidence that had been so evident in the beginning was now replaced with anxiety. The tide had turned. The jury was beginning to see Montgomery for who he truly was. As the trial neared its conclusion, George knew that this fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but the war was still on. Montgomery wouldn't go down without a fight, and George knew he had to stay vigilant. But for now, he could allow himself a moment of hope. The jury had deliberated for what felt like hours, and when they finally returned with their verdict, the room was tense with anticipation. The foreman stood up and read the decision aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Montgomery Enterprises, guilty on all charges. George could hardly believe his ears. The battle had been long, but they had won. After the jury's verdict, the courthouse was buzzing with energy, the weight of justice hanging in the air. But while the victory was sweet, George couldn't let his guard down just yet. He knew that the real fight had only just begun. Montgomery would not accept defeat quietly. With his wealth, influence, and power, he had resources that could turn the tables, if they weren't careful. George walked out of the courthouse with Clint by his side. The crowd outside cheered, but the noise felt distant to George. His mind was already racing. Montgomery would try everything to overturn the verdict, to discredit their case, or worse, to intimidate the witnesses. Clint noticed the worried look on his face. You're thinking about what comes next, aren't you? George nodded. I can't relax. Montgomery will appeal. He'll do everything in his power to make this go away. We have to prepare for the next round. This isn't over. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Montgomery's legal team immediately filed an appeal, citing errors in the trial, but George wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was Montgomery's increasingly aggressive tactics. Rumors began to spread around town that Montgomery had started targeting key witnesses, attempting to bribe them into changing their testimonies or, in some cases, offering them financial settlements to drop the charges. Several individuals who had been outspoken against Montgomery's business practices suddenly became unreachable, and others began acting strangely, hesitant to speak out in public. It was clear that Montgomery was trying to undermine the case from the inside, to destroy their foundation before they could even start their fight against the appeal. George and Clint gathered in George's office, sorting through all the new threats and legal documents. They needed to act fast before Montgomery could chip away at their case. "We need to find out who's behind these bribes," Clint said, his eyes narrow with determination. "If we can catch them in the act, it'll be game over for Montgomery. He'll have nowhere to hide." "Agreed," George replied. "We'll need to be smart about this. We can't rush in without solid proof. But I won't let him manipulate our witnesses." Emily, Sam, and the others on their team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, contacting the witnesses who had been approached and gathering intel. After weeks of investigation, they uncovered a pattern. Montgomery was using a shell company to funnel money to intermediaries who then approached the witnesses with lucrative deals or threats. It wasn't just about the money. Montgomery was trying to send a message, that no one could stand in his way. He had been doing this for years, using his wealth to bend the law to his will. But now, he was making a mistake. He underestimated the power of truth. One day, as George sat with Clint, Sam, and Emily in his office, they received a call that would change everything. "George," said the voice on the other end of the line, "I've got something you need to see. You won't believe it." The voice belonged to Emily, who had been working relentlessly to track down evidence of Montgomery's bribery operation. She had just found something huge, a video, hidden deep in the records, showing Montgomery himself in a private meeting with one of the witnesses. In the footage, Montgomery could be seen offering a substantial sum of money in exchange for the witness changing their testimony. It was damning evidence, a smoking gun that could not be ignored. This was the leverage they needed to destroy Montgomery's credibility once and for all. George watched the video, his heart pounding as he realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. "Clint, this is it," George said, his voice tight. "We've got him. This is the kind of evidence that can shut down his appeal and end this once and for all." Clint's eyes gleamed. "We take this straight to the judge. No more games. It's time to finish this." The next morning, George and Clint walked into Judge Harper's chambers, the video in hand. The judge had been briefed on the case, but when he saw the footage, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. "This is extraordinary," Judge Harper said, his voice low. "Montgomery's actions go beyond simple corruption. This is a direct attempt to tamper with the court's proceedings." George nodded, feeling a surge of relief. "We need to act fast. The longer this drags on, the more Montgomery can manipulate the system. If we can present this to the court, the appeal will be dismissed, and we can finally put this nightmare to rest." As they prepared for the next court appearance, George knew they couldn't afford to underestimate Montgomery. The defense would try to discredit the video, claiming it was doctored or taken out of context. They had to be prepared for anything. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was tense. The defense had already started making its case, spinning their usual narrative that George and his team had no real evidence, just a personal vendetta. But then, George's team presented the video. The moment the footage played, the courtroom fell silent. Montgomery, once untouchable, was exposed for all to see. His attempts to bribe and manipulate the witnesses were undeniable. The evidence was clear. The defense tried to argue that the video wasn't conclusive, that it could have been tampered with, but George knew they were fighting a losing battle. The judge listened intently, and George could feel the shift in the air. Montgomery's smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by desperation. After a tense few minutes of deliberation, Judge Harper turned to the court. "The evidence presented today leaves no doubt in my mind," the judge said firmly. "The court finds that Montgomery Enterprises has engaged in illegal and unethical practices to undermine the trial process. The appeal is hereby dismissed." This case will proceed to sentencing. George felt the weight of the word settle in. They had won. The court had not only dismissed Montgomery's appeal but had also ensured that the case would move forward to sentencing. It was a huge victory, but George knew the battle was far from over. The real work was still ahead, making sure Montgomery paid for the lives he had destroyed. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. The community had rallied behind George and his team, and now, they had a real chance at seeing justice served. Clint slapped George on the back with a grin. "We did it. He's not getting away this time." George smiled, but his thoughts were already on the next phase. This isn't over yet. We have to make sure Montgomery doesn't have any more tricks up his sleeve. And as the sun set over the town, George knew one thing for sure: no matter how dark the days ahead might be, they had the truth on their side. And the truth, as he had learned, was the most powerful weapon of all. The months following the trial were a whirlwind. George had always believed that justice would be his guiding light, but nothing could have prepared him for the personal and professional fallout that would come after the verdict. Though the legal system had found in his favor, the emotional and psychological toll of fighting Montgomery was far from over. George stood in front of his office window, staring out at the quiet streets below. It was a peaceful day in the town, but in his mind, it felt like everything was on the verge of falling apart. Montgomery's empire might have crumbled, but his influence and connections still loomed large, casting a shadow over George's every step. "George, are you all right?" Clint's voice broke through his thoughts. George turned around, giving his friend a weary smile. "Yeah, just thinking. It's over, right? Montgomery's appeal was dismissed, and the case is moving forward. But something tells me this isn't the end." Clint walked over, leaning against the doorframe. "You're not wrong. I'm not sure what Montgomery's going to do next, but I'm betting he's not done yet. He's probably got a few tricks left up his sleeve." George ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. The legal victory feels hollow when I look at everything Montgomery did. The families he ruined, the lives he destroyed. This is bigger than just one man. This is about an entire system that's been corrupted, and we've only scratched the surface." Clint nodded. "You're right. But we can't let him get away with it. If we don't keep pushing, the damage Montgomery caused could spread further than we think." That afternoon, Emily came to George's office with unsettling news. "I just got off the phone with some of our witnesses," she said, her expression serious. "Montgomery's people are still reaching out to them. They've even started intimidating them, showing up at their homes, threatening their families." George clenched his fists, his anger flaring. "How is that even possible? The court ruled in our favor. He shouldn't be able to do this." "I know," Emily replied, "but Montgomery still has the power to cause damage. His influence extends far beyond just his company. He's got people in every corner of this town, and he's not afraid to use them to get what he wants." Clint shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't just about land anymore. Montgomery's using fear to try to control everything. He's going after the heart of the town itself." George stood up, his mind made up. "We need to fight fire with fire. We can't back down now, not when we're this close." The next day, George, Clint, Emily, and Sam gathered in the conference room, preparing for the next phase of their strategy. They had already secured the evidence they needed to expose Montgomery's corrupt dealings, but now they needed to make sure that no one could intimidate them into silence. "We've got to be smart about this," George said. "Montgomery's people are out there, trying to scare us into submission. But we're not going to let that happen. We need to take a stand, not just in the courtroom, but everywhere. The more people know about what Montgomery's been doing, the harder it'll be for him to keep manipulating them." Sam spoke up, his voice filled with determination. "We should go public. There's no reason to keep hiding in the shadows. The people deserve to know the truth." If we can get the media on our side, Montgomery won't be able to intimidate anyone anymore. Emily added, I can contact the local news stations, get them involved. We need to make sure the public knows that this isn't just a legal battle, it's a fight for the soul of our town. George nodded. Let's do it. We're not backing down. This is our town, and we're not going to let Montgomery take it from us. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. George and his team worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, dig deeper into Montgomery's web of lies, and make sure the media had everything they needed to expose him. They released detailed reports, gave interviews, and made sure that every shred of Montgomery's corruption was brought into the light. The town began to rally behind them. People who had once been silent, too afraid of Montgomery's influence, started speaking out. Local businesses voiced their support, and the public grew more vocal in their condemnation of Montgomery's actions. It felt like the town was finally waking up, realizing that they had the power to change their future. But as the pressure mounted, Montgomery fought back harder. He filed lawsuits to try to silence the media, hired private investigators to follow George and his team, and even resorted to smear campaigns to turn public opinion against them. It was clear that Montgomery would stop at nothing to protect his legacy, even if it meant destroying the very town he had once controlled. One evening, as George sat at his desk reviewing some new reports, he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in years. George, it's Jack. We need to talk. Jack was an old friend from George's past, a journalist who had once worked with George's father. George hadn't heard from him since he moved away years ago. Jack's voice was urgent, almost frantic. What's going on, Jack? I've been digging into Montgomery, Jack said, his voice shaking. And I've found something you need to know. Something big. The next day, Jack met George and Clint at a quiet diner outside of town. He slid a manila folder across the table, his hands trembling. Take a look at this, Jack said. Montgomery's been hiding something much bigger than we thought. Inside the folder was a collection of documents and photos, detailing illegal land deals that went far beyond anything George had uncovered so far. These weren't just minor violations, these were large-scale operations, involving bribery, blackmail, and the exploitation of vulnerable communities. The documents were explosive, the kind of evidence that could bring Montgomery down for good. George felt a knot tighten in his chest as he looked through the papers. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. If they could get this information into the right hands, Montgomery wouldn't just lose his appeal. He would lose everything. We've got him, George said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the discovery. This is the truth we've been searching for. Clint leaned in, his expression determined. Let's get it out there. Once people see this, Montgomery will have no choice but to face the consequences. The days following the release of the explosive documents were tense. The media storm that George and his team had anticipated had arrived, and it hit with the force of a hurricane. News stations, social media, and newspapers were flooded with the revelations of Montgomery's criminal activity. The town, once held captive by his influence, now stood in defiance, emboldened by the courage of those who had dared to speak out. George, Clint, Emily, and Sam watched from their strategy room, the weight of the situation settling in. There was no turning back now. They had gone public with everything. The truth was out, and Montgomery had nowhere left to hide. Did we just set off a bomb? Emily asked, her voice calm, but her eyes betraying a hint of concern. We did, George replied, his gaze fixed on the TV screen showing a live report on Montgomery's empire crumbling. But it's not just a bomb, it's the start of the end for him. We have the evidence. The people know the truth. Montgomery's reign of terror is over. Sam leaned in, scanning through the latest headlines. There's no way Montgomery can recover from this. His entire business model was built on lies and intimidation. But he'll fight back, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Clint's voice was steady, but filled with a quiet urgency. "We're ready. We've already prepared the next phase. The more Montgomery tries to fight this, the more he'll expose his own corruption. It's only a matter of time before the walls close in." As the days wore on, the pressure on Montgomery mounted. Protests erupted outside his company's headquarters, demanding accountability. The town, once divided, had united in the face of injustice. However, Montgomery was not one to go down without a fight. He began using his remaining influence to launch a counterattack, hiring a top-tier legal team to try to discredit the evidence George and his team had uncovered. One afternoon, as George was reviewing legal papers, Clint walked into his office, a grim look on his face. "George, it's happening," Clint said, his voice filled with urgency. "Montgomery's filing an injunction to block any further media coverage. He's even threatening to sue the news outlets for defamation. He's pulling out all the stops." George didn't flinch. He'd been expecting this. "Let him. The truth is on our side, and we've got too much momentum to be stopped now. The more he fights, the more people will see the truth." Clint nodded, but the worry still lingered in his eyes. "We've been in this fight long enough to know that Montgomery doesn't play fair. He's going to come after us, George. He'll do anything to protect himself. Anything." That evening, as George and Clint sat together in the quiet of George's office, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. Clint's words echoed in George's mind. They had fought hard, but Montgomery was ruthless. No one knew how far he would go to protect his empire. As if on cue, Emily burst into the office, holding a letter in her hand. Her face was pale. "George, Clint, you need to see this," she said, breathless. The letter was from Montgomery's legal team, threatening legal action against them for releasing what they called false and defamatory information. It was full of veiled threats, warning them to retract the evidence or face severe consequences. George felt a flash of anger, but he quickly suppressed it. "He's trying to intimidate us," he said, his voice cold. "This is exactly what we've been preparing for. We're not backing down." Clint slapped the letter onto the table. "We'll fight this in court, but we also need to make sure Montgomery knows that we're not scared of him. This letter is a declaration of war, and we need to be ready to respond." As the legal battle unfolded, George and his team doubled down on their efforts to expose Montgomery's corruption. They continued to meet with journalists, giving them exclusive insights into Montgomery's illegal dealings, and ensuring the public was kept informed. The pressure on Montgomery's empire was mounting, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would bring it all crashing down. But George knew they had to stay vigilant. Montgomery was no ordinary adversary. He had connections everywhere, and he wouldn't hesitate to use them. The more George learned about Montgomery's past, the more he realized just how far the man was willing to go to maintain control. One evening, after a long day of meetings, George sat alone in his office, staring at the stacks of documents in front of him. He thought about all the lives Montgomery had destroyed, the people who had been silenced by fear and greed. This fight had started as a personal one, but now, it felt like something much bigger. The door to his office creaked open, and Clint stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," Clint said, handing George a cup. "We've got to keep pushing forward, George. The finish line's in sight." George took the coffee, but his mind was elsewhere. "Clint, do you ever wonder if we're making a difference? If all this is worth it?" Clint leaned back in the chair across from George. "Of course, we do. We wouldn't be here if we didn't think it was worth it. But it's about more than just beating Montgomery. It's about showing everyone in this town that they don't have to live in fear anymore. We're fighting for them. We're fighting for the truth." George looked out the window, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. He had come a long way from the man who had first walked into this fight with nothing but a desire for justice. Now, he was a symbol of that very justice, a beacon of hope for those who had once felt powerless. "I know," George said softly. "But it's hard to see the end of this sometimes. Montgomery is a beast. And we've got a long way to go." Clint smiled, leaning forward. "We'll get there. We've already won. We just have to make sure Montgomery knows it." The next day, George and his team received another unexpected visitor. This time, it wasn't a lawyer or a journalist, but someone much more unexpected, one of Montgomery's former allies. The man, a once powerful figure in Montgomery's organization, had turned against him. He had been watching the fight from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to step forward. And now, he was ready to talk. "I've seen enough," the man said, his voice shaking. "Montgomery's been doing things that no one should ever know about. He's been laundering money, bribing officials, using the company to fund illegal activities. It's all true. Everything George has been saying." George felt a rush of hope. "This is it. This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." The man handed over a flash drive. "This contains everything: documents, emails, financial records. It's all there. I've already contacted the authorities. You need to make sure this gets to the right people." George stared at the flash drive, his heart pounding. This was the final nail in Montgomery's coffin. They had everything they needed to bring him down for good. He turned to Clint, who was already on the phone with their contacts in law enforcement. "This is it, Clint. It's over." Clint nodded, a grim smile on his face. "We're finally going to put an end to this. Montgomery's empire is falling apart. And nothing is going to save him now." The days following the flash drive delivery were a blur. The evidence that had been handed over was nothing short of explosive, and George, Clint, Emily, and Sam knew they had the upper hand. But as they prepared to release this final piece of the puzzle to the authorities, there was an unsettling sense of tension in the air. Montgomery's empire was on the brink of collapse, but it was clear that the final battle was not going to be an easy one. News of the new evidence leaked, and the public response was electric. News outlets scrambled to confirm the details, and social media exploded with speculation and anger. It was as if the town had been holding its breath for years, and now, the truth was finally surfacing, giving them a voice they had been denied for so long. But Montgomery, true to form, was not going to go down quietly. In the weeks that followed, his legal team ramped up their efforts, filing multiple motions to block the release of the new evidence. Montgomery himself was rarely seen in public, but his presence loomed large, as though he was still in control, manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. It was early one morning when George received an unexpected phone call. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but there was something in the caller's voice that sounded urgent. "George, it's Jack. You need to come to the courthouse, now." The words sent a chill down George's spine. He had a feeling that this wasn't just a casual call. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office, Clint following closely behind. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, lawyers, and onlookers. There was an air of anticipation, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. George and Clint made their way through the throng, heading straight for Jack, who was waiting near the entrance. "What's going on?" George asked, his voice low. Jack, his face pale, glanced nervously around before speaking. "It's Montgomery. He's filed an emergency motion, but there's more. The judge who's been presiding over this case, Judge Thompson, he's been compromised." George froze. "What do you mean, compromised?" Jack's eyes were filled with concern. "I've been doing some digging. Judge Thompson has ties to Montgomery. It's all buried deep, but it's there. The motion Montgomery filed is an attempt to influence the case from the inside, to delay the proceedings and buy himself more time." Clint's face darkened. "This is bad. This could be the break Montgomery's been waiting for." George clenched his fists. We can't let this slide. We've come too far to be stopped now. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. George, Clint, and Jack sat together in the gallery, waiting for the hearing to begin. They knew this was a critical moment. If Montgomery's motion was granted, it could delay the inevitable. But if they could expose Judge Thompson's corruption, it would be a major blow to Montgomery's strategy. When the judge entered the courtroom, all eyes turned toward him. Judge Thompson was a tall man in his late 50s, with a reputation for being fair and impartial. But now, in the face of Montgomery's influence, he seemed almost out of place. George could see the faintest hint of unease in the judge's eyes as he took his seat. The hearing began, and Montgomery's lawyer wasted no time in presenting the emergency motion. The courtroom was tense as the lawyer argued that the evidence against Montgomery was tainted and that more time was needed to verify the legitimacy of the documents. As Montgomery's lawyer spoke, George and Clint exchanged a look. They knew that this was the moment they had to act. They had to expose the corruption that was lurking in the shadows, or everything they had fought for would be in jeopardy. Emily had been working in the background, gathering more information about Judge Thompson's ties to Montgomery. She had been able to track down the financial records, proving that the judge had received large, unexplained donations from one of Montgomery's companies. The evidence was irrefutable, and they knew it was their ace in the hole. As the lawyer finished his argument, George stood up, his voice steady and clear. Your Honor, if I may, I have something to present that calls into question the legitimacy of this motion. The courtroom fell silent as George approached the bench, holding a manila folder. He slid it across to Judge Thompson, who glanced at it briefly before turning his gaze back to George. What is this, Mr. Knight? Judge Thompson's voice was measured, but there was an undercurrent of tension in it. George's eyes met the judge's. This is evidence that shows Judge Thompson has been financially linked to Montgomery's companies. The donations were made over several years, and they appear to be tied to rulings made in Montgomery's favor. I believe this raises serious questions about the impartiality of this court. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Thompson's face turned crimson, and for a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped. Montgomery's lawyer leapt to his feet, shouting, "Objection! This is a blatant attack on the integrity of this court." But George didn't back down. Your Honor, we have irrefutable evidence. This is not just a question of ethics. This is about the law, and it's clear that Montgomery has used his influence to manipulate the system. Clint stepped forward, his voice low and firm. We're not asking for any favors, Judge. We're asking for fairness. The people in this town deserve nothing less. The judge remained silent for a long moment, his eyes flicking back and forth between George, Clint, and Montgomery's lawyer. The courtroom was in a state of shock. No one had expected this twist, least of all Montgomery, who sat in the front row, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, Judge Thompson stood, his voice cold and stern. I will take this new evidence under consideration. The hearing will be adjourned until further notice. Outside the courthouse, George and Clint stood together, the weight of what had just happened settling on them. They had exposed Montgomery's last hope of manipulating the system. The judge's reaction had been telling. He knew he couldn't ignore the evidence. We did it, Clint said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and determination. George nodded, but his mind was racing. It's not over yet. Montgomery's going to come after us harder now. We've hit him where it hurts, and he's not going to let it slide. But we're ready, Clint replied. We've fought too hard to back down now. As they walked away from the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered outside began to disperse, their murmurs filled with excitement and hope. The people of the town were watching, waiting, and they were ready for change. That evening, as George sat in his office, staring out at the street below, he realized just how far they had come. It had been a long and difficult road, but they were on the cusp of something bigger than themselves. And in that moment, George understood. This wasn't just about taking down Montgomery. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. It was about showing the world that the truth could not be silenced. The storm had come. But the calm was finally within reach. The final days before the trial were the most intense George had ever experienced. The media coverage continued to intensify, and with each passing day, Montgomery's empire continued to crumble. The public was in an uproar, demanding justice. But even with the damning evidence against Montgomery, George knew that the fight wasn't over. The most dangerous moment was still ahead. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Montgomery's financial ties to the judge, the criminal activities exposed by the flash drive, the stolen funds, the widespread corruption, it was all coming together. But Montgomery had one last card to play: his power, his wealth, and his network of dangerous associates. It was a crisp morning when George received the call. He had just sat down at his desk to review the final motions for the trial when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "George, it's Jack. I need you to come to the office. There's something you need to see." George's stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and anticipation. He grabbed his coat and headed out the door, Clint and Emily close behind. As they walked into Jack's office, they immediately saw that something was wrong. Jack's face was drawn, and his eyes were tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. "What is it?" George asked, his heart racing. Jack silently slid a file across the table. George flipped it open, and his heart dropped. Inside was a list of names, influential names from the business world, law enforcement, and even politics. All had been tied to Montgomery in some capacity, with each person listed as having received payments or bribes over the years. Jack's voice was grave. "Montgomery's pulled out all the stops. These are the people he's using to try and influence the trial. He's already starting to pull strings. They're pushing for delays, for the trial to be moved to a different jurisdiction. It's getting ugly, George." Clint slammed his fist onto the desk. "This is exactly what we expected. Montgomery won't stop until he's burned the whole system down around him." George looked at the names in front of him, his jaw set. He had always known Montgomery was ruthless, but now it was clear just how deep his corruption ran. This wasn't just about one man's greed, it was about a network of people who had all benefited from the suffering of others. And Montgomery was going to use every last one of them to escape justice. "We can't let him get away with this," George said, his voice cold and resolute. "We need to expose every last one of them, every single person involved." Emily nodded in agreement. "But how? They're pulling strings at every level. We need to make sure the truth comes out, and that Montgomery faces justice." George turned to Clint, a plan already forming in his mind. "Clint, it's time we went on the offensive. We have to take this to the media. It's time the whole town sees who Montgomery really is, and who's been helping him. If we expose these people publicly, the pressure will be too much for Montgomery to handle." Clint hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. We'll get the word out. But we need to make sure we have the support of the people. If they don't believe in us, they'll never believe in the case." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. George and his team worked around the clock, preparing for their final assault. They contacted reporters who had been covering the case, providing them with the names of Montgomery's associates and the evidence they had gathered. At the same time, they worked with law enforcement to ensure that the necessary actions would be taken to stop any last-minute attempts by Montgomery's allies to manipulate the trial. They filed motions to prevent further delays, pushing for the case to be tried swiftly and decisively. And then, in a dramatic move, they called a press conference. The press conference was held in a large hall, with cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. George stood at the podium, Clint and Emily by his side. The atmosphere was electric, this was the moment that would either make or break their entire effort. "I have just one message for the people of this town," George began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "This man, Montgomery, has been lying to you. He's been stealing from you. And for years, he's been using his wealth and power to control this town and manipulate the system. But that ends today." The room fell silent, and George could feel the weight of the audience's gaze. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We've uncovered the truth. The financial corruption, the bribes, the illegal activities, it's all here. And we're not backing down until Montgomery is held accountable. But we can't do this alone. We need the people of this town to stand with us. We need you to believe in the truth. We need you to fight for justice." A reporter raised his hand. "But George, Montgomery has powerful allies. How can you be sure this will work? What's stopping him from manipulating the system again?" George met the reporter's gaze, his answer clear. "Nothing will stop us. Not anymore." Montgomery thought he could hide behind his wealth and connections. He thought he could control everything. But the truth is more powerful than any amount of money. And today, we're taking that truth to the world. The aftermath of the press conference was nothing short of extraordinary. The town rallied behind George and his team, eager to see Montgomery finally brought to justice. The media coverage exploded, and the public outcry grew louder by the day. Even Montgomery's most influential allies began to distance themselves, afraid of being dragged down with him. But Montgomery was not one to go quietly. The days leading up to the trial were filled with new threats, new schemes, and new attempts to delay the inevitable. His legal team worked overtime, filing last-minute motions and attempting to discredit George and his team at every turn. But each time they tried, George and Clint were one step ahead, prepared for every move. Then, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, onlookers, and victims of Montgomery's schemes. The judge, now under heavy scrutiny, was forced to recuse himself, and a new, impartial judge was appointed to oversee the proceedings. The mood was tense, but there was a sense of anticipation in the air. This was it, the final showdown. George and Clint stood side by side, ready for the battle they had been preparing for. Montgomery, now visibly shaken, sat across the courtroom, flanked by his lawyers. His confidence, once so unshakable, had begun to crack. The trial began, and the evidence was presented, the documents, the testimonies, the financial records. The weight of the truth was overwhelming. Montgomery's empire, built on lies and deceit, was collapsing under its own weight. But even as the case against him grew stronger, Montgomery's final act of defiance was still to come. As the trial reached its climax, Montgomery stood up from his seat, a smirk on his face. "Your Honor," he said, his voice loud and defiant. "I have one last piece of evidence to present." The courtroom went silent. George and Clint exchanged uneasy glances. They knew this was coming, Montgomery wasn't about to go down without a fight. The judge looked skeptical but nodded. "Proceed." Montgomery's lawyer stepped forward, holding a folder. "This is a list of contacts, records, and communications. It proves that George Knight and his team have been manipulating the system, fabricating evidence, and orchestrating this entire case for personal gain." The room gasped. George felt his heart race. He knew this was a last-ditch attempt to discredit them, but it was a dangerous move. Clint's voice was steady as he turned to George. "This is it. We can't let this stand." George nodded, his mind racing. But then, he remembered something, a small detail, hidden in the records they had obtained. Montgomery had made a crucial mistake, one that could turn everything around. He stood up, his voice steady and calm. "Your Honor, I respectfully request to submit new evidence." The judge nodded, and George walked to the front of the courtroom, his eyes locked on Montgomery. "The evidence Montgomery just presented is a fabrication. Here is the truth, the records he's showing you are tampered with, and here is proof of that. This was the final attempt to destroy the case and the integrity of the system. The judge looked at the new evidence. Montgomery's smirk faltered. The truth had won. The trial came to a close, and Montgomery's empire, at last, came crashing down. It had taken years, countless hours of work, and a tireless pursuit of justice, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. And George, Clint, Emily, and Sam had achieved what they had set out to do. They had taken down a powerful man, exposed a corrupt system, and shown the world that justice could still win. As the final gavel came down, George couldn't help but think of everything they had been through, the battles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. But through it all, they had never given up. And now, the people of the town could finally breathe easy. The courtroom buzzed with the sound of people filing out, reporters scrambling to get the last quotes, and lawyers packing their briefcases. The weight of what had just happened began to settle on George. He stood still, his eyes scanning the now empty room. Montgomery's empire had crumbled, but the victory didn't feel like the triumphant moment he had imagined. Instead, it felt different. Not anticlimactic, but real, grounding in a way that made George rethink everything he had just been through. Clint stood beside him, the two of them silent for a moment. It was the first time since the trial had started that George saw Clint as more than just a mentor or a partner. Clint had been a steady presence in his life, someone who believed in George's potential when George hadn't even known he had it. Now, the weight of everything they had accomplished seemed to sit heavily on Clint's shoulders too. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Clint asked, his voice low, almost reflective. George nodded. "I thought it would feel like a victory. I guess in a way, it is, but I'm not sure I'm ready for the aftermath yet." Clint chuckled softly, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "That's the thing with real change, George. It doesn't come all at once. It's a process, a journey. And even though you've won, the work doesn't stop here." George turned to face him. "What happens next?" Clint took a deep breath and placed a hand on George's shoulder. "You keep moving forward. And you keep doing what you know is right. This is just the beginning for you. You've proven to yourself what you're capable of. What matters now is how you take that strength and turn it into something that makes a difference." Later that evening, George sat in the quiet of his office, the faint glow of the city lights shining through the window. The office felt strangely empty now that the case was over. For weeks, it had been filled with constant motion, meetings, phone calls, strategizing. And now, there was only silence. George leaned back in his chair, his mind replaying the events of the trial. He thought about his life before all of this began. The fear he felt when he first started his legal career, unsure of his ability to make a real impact. The moments of doubt when it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. And yet, here he was, a man who had fought the biggest challenge of his life and come out victorious. Through it all, he had learned something profound: it was never too late to stand up for what was right. The world could seem overwhelming, and sometimes, the system appeared to be rigged against those without power. But George had witnessed firsthand how even the most insurmountable obstacles could be overcome with integrity, perseverance, and the courage to fight. Clint knocked on the door, interrupting George's thoughts. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" "Not at all," George said, gesturing for Clint to take a seat. Clint leaned back in the chair, looking thoughtful. "I was thinking about how far you've come, George. You've always had the potential, but it took something big to bring it out. You took a risk, and now, you've made a difference, not just in this case, but in the lives of the people who'll never forget what you did." George's eyes softened. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Emily, Sam, the whole team. We couldn't have done it alone." Clint nodded. "True. But it was your decision to act. That's what makes the difference." George smiled faintly, but the weight of Clint's words lingered. "I guess I've learned that even in the darkest times, when everything feels impossible, there's always hope. You can always find a way forward if you stay true to what matters." The following weeks were filled with press conferences, interviews, and media coverage as the town began to process the full impact of the case. George had expected the spotlight to feel uncomfortable, but as time passed, he found peace in it. It wasn't about the fame or recognition. It was about the truth finally coming to light and knowing that he had played a part in that. Through it all, Clint remained by his side, though he didn't linger long. It was clear that Clint's work with George was coming to an end, not because of any falling out, but because Clint knew that George was ready. It was time for him to stand on his own, without the constant guidance of a mentor. Clint had given him the tools, and now, it was George's turn to carry them forward. One afternoon, Clint stopped by George's office once more. "You've come a long way, George," Clint said, his voice sincere. "And I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Clint," George replied, feeling a knot in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you." Clint smiled. "That's why we're in this business, to pass it on, to help others find their strength." With that, Clint stood, ready to leave. But just before he walked out the door, he turned back. "Remember, George. The fight's never truly over. But you've got what it takes. Don't forget that." George watched Clint leave, and for the first time, he felt like he truly understood what Clint had meant. The journey was never truly over. There would always be new challenges, new injustices to fight, new roads to walk. But George knew now that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, George walked out of his office for the last time that week. The streets of the city, now free from Montgomery's shadow, seemed to hum with possibility. It was a new beginning. For George, for Clint, and for the community that had been rocked to its core. George's mind was clear. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was someone who had made a difference. Someone who had stood up when others were too afraid. And that was something no one could ever take from him. He took a deep breath, looking out over the city. There was still so much work to do, but now, he knew that he could face it with confidence. With the lessons learned, the strength he had discovered, and the knowledge that it was never too late to change the world. "Here's to the future," he whispered to himself. "And the fight that never ends." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?